The Crusades, did they contribute to the formation of the West? In the late 11th century, a series of military and religious campaigns launched from Christian Europe toward the Islamic East, later known as the Crusades. This massive military movement was driven by intertwined religious, political, and economic motives, as popes and European rulers saw it as an opportunity to unite Christendom under a single banner, while knights and adventurers viewed it as a chance to achieve glory and wealth. Yet the question remains, to what extent did these campaigns contribute to shaping Western civilization as we know it today? Before the launch of the First Crusade, Europe was living under a fragmented feudal system, with power divided among weak kings and feudal lords vying for influence. However, with the call issued by Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont in 1095, Europe's attention turned toward a common goal, liberating the Holy Land from Muslim control. This appeal was not merely a holy war but also an attempt to redirect Europe's internal conflicts toward an external enemy, thereby strengthening the Church's authority and fostering centralized governance militarily. The Crusades witnessed advancements in combat techniques and military organization. European knights were exposed to new strategies through their encounters with Islamic and Byzantine armies. For the first time, religious military orders such as the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller emerged, combining monasticism and warfare, and they became powerful military and financial entities with long-term impacts on Europe's military and financial systems. Economically, the Crusades opened new trade routes between East and West. Eastern goods such as spices, silk, and dyes flowed into European markets, stimulating commercial activity and contributing to the growth of Italian cities like Venice and Genoa, which later became centers of the European Renaissance. Additionally, contact with the Islamic world facilitated the transfer of scientific and philosophical knowledge preserved in Arabic libraries, aiding the revival of Greco-Roman heritage in Europe. Culturally, the Crusades had a profound impact on the European imagination. They spawned vast literature, from chivalric tales to historical narratives, which sometimes depicted the Crusaders as heroes and other times as victims. The clash with Islamic civilization also made Europeans more aware of their cultural distinctiveness, contributing to the formation of a unique Western identity. Yet, despite these influences, debate persists over whether the Crusades decisively shaped the West or were merely one episode in a long series of historical developments. Some historians argue that their impact was limited compared to other movements like the Renaissance or the Protestant Reformation, while others see them as the first step in Europe's global expansion. Ultimately, the Crusades remain a pivotal event in medieval history, representing a point of convergence between East and West and contributing, whether directly or indirectly, to Europe's political, economic, and cultural transformation in complex ways. How did the Crusades influence the rise of the merchant class? The Crusades were a series of military campaigns launched by the Christian European world between the 11th and 13th centuries, aiming to control the Holy Land in the Middle East. Although the military and political outcomes of these wars were mixed, their impact on Europe's economic and social landscape was profound, particularly in strengthening the merchant class and fostering urban prosperity. Before the Crusades, the European economy was primarily based on the feudal system, where power and wealth were concentrated in the hands of nobles and landowners, while peasants worked in agriculture to secure basic sustenance. Trade was limited, and most economic activity was local. However, with the launch of the Crusades, this picture gradually changed. First, the Crusades required massive financing, prompting many nobles to sell their lands or borrow money from merchants to fund their campaigns. This led to a transfer of wealth from the aristocracy to the emerging merchant class, which began accumulating significant capital. Additionally, the need to supply armies with provisions and weapons encouraged the development of more complex trade networks linking Europe and the Middle East. Second, the Crusades opened new trade routes between East and West. Europeans became acquainted with goods they were previously unfamiliar with, such as silk, spices, sugar, and dyes, which were imported from the East through cities like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. These Italian cities, which played a key role in transporting soldiers and supplies, greatly benefited from trade with the Islamic and Byzantine worlds, turning them into powerful economic hubs. Third, the boom in trade led to the growth of cities and an increase in their populations, as many migrated from rural areas to urban centers in search of work in crafts or trade. This shift gradually weakened the feudal system, as wealth was no longer measured solely by land ownership but also by liquidity and investment capabilities. Finally, the Crusades contributed to the development of more sophisticated financial systems, such as the emergence of money changers and the beginnings of banking. Due to the difficulty of carrying money on long journeys, financial drafts and credit notes appeared, facilitating commercial transactions over long distances. In short, although the Crusades did not achieve their religious or military objectives permanently, they transformed Europe economically and socially. By boosting trade and creating new economic networks, they contributed to the rise of the merchant class, which later became a driving force in the Renaissance and the transition to modern capitalism. The Crusades were a series of medieval military campaigns launched by Europeans to seize control of the Holy Land in the Middle East. Although these wars were, at their core, bloody conflicts, they served as a civilizational bridge through which numerous technological and scientific advancements were transferred from the Islamic world to Europe. At the time, Islamic cities were thriving centers of knowledge and industry, while Europe remained largely feudal and backward in many aspects. When the Crusaders returned home after years of direct contact with Islamic civilization, they brought back ideas and technologies that altered the course of development on the continent. Among the most notable innovations were advanced irrigation techniques learned from the Muslims, including canal and water wheel systems that significantly improved agriculture. They also adopted refined methods of textile manufacturing and dyeing, which had been perfected in major cities like Damascus and Cairo. In architecture, Europeans were introduced to sophisticated construction techniques observed in Islamic castles and palaces, such as the use of pointed arches and domes, which later became fundamental elements of Gothic architecture. They also embraced new methods of military fortification after witnessing the resilience of Muslim strongholds that withstood prolonged sieges. In the field of medicine, Europe lagged far behind the Islamic world, where physicians used advanced surgical tools and relied on the works of Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and Al-Razi for diagnosing and treating diseases. When Crusaders brought back concepts like mobile hospitals and the segregation of patients by illness, Europe began adopting these ideas, laying the foundation for future medical progress. Military technology also saw significant advancements. Europeans benefited from Muslim expertise in using trebuchets and early gunpowder weapons deployed in certain battles. They also adopted techniques for forging durable steel swords, which far surpassed their traditional weaponry. The influences were not limited to material innovations but extended to theoretical sciences as well. The Crusaders brought back Arabic scientific texts, which were later translated into Latin, reintroducing Europeans to Greek knowledge that had been lost during the Dark Ages. They also became acquainted with the Arabic numeral system, which simplified complex calculations compared to the cumbersome Roman numerals. The Crusades marked a turning point in European history, opening the eyes of leaders and scholars to a more advanced civilization and sparking a gradual renaissance fueled by the knowledge the Crusaders brought back. Despite their violent nature, the Crusades left a cultural legacy that played a crucial role in transitioning Europe from the Dark Ages toward the Renaissance. How did the Crusades contribute to the end of feudalism? In the Middle Ages, Europe lived under the feudal system, a socio-economic and political structure based on the distribution of land and power among nobles and lords, where peasants worked the land in exchange for protection. However, with the emergence of the Crusades in the 11th century, major changes began that gradually led to the collapse of this system. When Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade in 1095, thousands of knights and peasants gathered under the banner of the cross, heading east to liberate the Holy Land from Islamic rule. These campaigns were not merely religious wars but also a turning point in European history. Over 2 centuries, the Crusades transformed Europe's social and economic structures, paving the way for the decline of feudalism. First, the Crusades weakened the power of local nobles. Many feudal lords joined the campaigns, forcing them to sell or mortgage their lands to cover the exorbitant costs of travel and war. Some never returned, causing their lands to revert to the crown or the church. Additionally, the wars drained the resources of many fiefdoms, diminishing their economic and military strength. Second, the Crusades contributed to the growth of cities and the expansion of trade. With new routes opening to the east, commerce flourished between Europe and the Islamic and Byzantine worlds. Italian cities such as Venice and Genoa became major economic powers, dominating the trade in spices, silk, and luxury goods. This commercial growth gave rise to a new class of wealthy merchants who were outside the traditional feudal hierarchy, undermining the nobles' economic dominance. Third, the Crusades brought changes in military tactics. With advancements in warfare and an increasing reliance on professional soldiers rather than feudal knights, the importance of the feudal system began to wane. Kings seized this opportunity to strengthen their central authority, becoming less dependent on nobles for military support and instead building permanent, paid armies. Finally, the Crusades shifted European perspectives. Exposure to new cultures and advanced technologies in the East made Europeans more open to innovation. Meanwhile, the Church, which had supported feudalism, began losing some of its influence after the failure of many campaigns, paving the way for reform and change. Over time, the power of feudal lords declined in favor of kings, cities, and merchants, ushering in a new era in Europe, the Renaissance and centralized states. Thus, the Crusades played a crucial role in transitioning Europe from feudalism to a more modern and diverse system. The role of military orders in the formation of nation-states in the dawn of the Middle Ages, as the great empires fragmented and the feudal system declined, new contours of power and sovereignty began to emerge. Military orders, though semi-monastic organizations that combined religious fervor with warfare, were among the most significant factors contributing to the formation of nation-states in Europe. These orders arose in the context of the Crusades, serving as elite, trained forces fighting to defend Christian interests in the Holy Land. Yet their influence extended beyond the battlefield, shaping the political and social structures that would underpin the nation-state. These orders, such as the Knights Templar, the Teutonic Knights, and the Order of Santiago, possessed highly disciplined organizational structures resembling those of modern standing armies. Their loyalties were not confined to local kings or feudal lords but were tied to the papacy and transnational agendas. Nevertheless, their role in promoting political centralization was profound. When European monarchies absorbed or dissolved these orders, they leveraged their military and administrative expertise to build permanent armies, a cornerstone of the modern state. In the Iberian Peninsula, for instance, military orders played a pivotal role in the Reconquista against Islamic kingdoms. They were not merely instruments of war but also a means of consolidating royal authority in frontier regions. By granting these orders land and privileges, monarchs gradually secured the loyalty of these territories, helping to unify competing kingdoms under stronger centralized rule. In Northern Europe, the Teutonic Knights established a network of fortresses and settlements that paved the way for the emergence of states like Prussia, which later became a core part of the German nation. Economically, these orders amassed vast wealth, managed through primitive banking networks, exemplified by the Knights Templar, who developed a financial system akin to modern banking. When these orders were disbanded, emerging monarchies seized their resources, bolstering state treasuries and funding growing bureaucracies. Most importantly, however, was the organizational legacy they left behind. They provided a model of hierarchical administration based on obedience and discipline, which nation-states later adopted for their armies and governmental apparatus. Moreover, the concept of loyalty to an abstract idea, whether religious or national, originated with these orders before evolving into a foundation of national identity. Thus, while military orders began as religious and martial tools, they became building blocks of the modern state. Their influence was not always direct, but it was profound, helping to transform Europe from a fractured continent into a mosaic of interconnected, centralized states that would eventually shape the global political order as we know it today. The impact of the Crusades on internal European development. The Crusades, a series of religious and military campaigns spanning from the late 11th to the late 13th centuries, profoundly influenced the internal development of Europe. These expeditions, initially launched to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control, had far-reaching consequences that extended beyond their immediate military objectives. The Crusades reshaped European society, economy, politics, and culture in ways that would lay the groundwork for the transition from the medieval to the early modern period. One of the most significant impacts of the Crusades was the stimulation of economic growth and trade. As European knights, merchants, and pilgrims traveled to the Levant, they encountered advanced commercial networks and goods previously unknown or rare in Europe. Spices, silks, dyes, and other luxury items from the East began flowing into European markets, creating demand that revitalized trade routes. Italian city-states such as Venice, Genoa, and Pisa emerged as dominant maritime powers, establishing trading colonies in the eastern Mediterranean. The increased circulation of wealth and the rise of a money-based economy weakened the feudal system, as lords increasingly demanded cash payments rather than traditional feudal obligations. This shift contributed to the decline of serfdom and the growth of a more mobile and urbanized society. Politically, the Crusades had a dual effect on European monarchies and nobility. On one hand, the costly and often disastrous campaigns drained the resources of many noble families, weakening their power and allowing kings to consolidate authority. The need to finance crusades led to the development of more sophisticated taxation systems and centralized bureaucracies. On the other hand, the Crusades also reinforced the prestige of the Church and the papacy, as they positioned themselves as the spiritual and organizational leaders of Christendom. However, the failure of later Crusades and the Church's involvement in secular conflicts eventually led to disillusionment and criticism, paving the way for future religious reforms and challenges to papal authority. Socially, the Crusades fostered a sense of shared Christian identity among Europeans, even as they exposed them to diverse cultures and peoples. The encounters with Byzantine and Islamic civilizations introduced Europeans to new ideas in science, medicine, philosophy, and architecture. The transmission of classical Greek texts, preserved and expanded upon by Muslim scholars, would later fuel the intellectual revival of the Renaissance. Additionally, the Crusades contributed to the rise of chivalric ideals, blending religious devotion with martial valor, which influenced European nobility for centuries. Yet, the Crusades also had darker consequences. The persecution of Jews within Europe intensified, as Crusaders often targeted Jewish communities in their fervor. The concept of holy war was later turned inward during conflicts such as the Albigensian Crusade, where Christian armies attacked other Christians deemed heretical. The prolonged military campaigns also led to significant demographic changes, as many nobles and soldiers never returned, altering inheritance patterns and land ownership. In the long term, the Crusades accelerated Europe's integration into a wider world, breaking its relative isolation and setting the stage for future exploration and expansion. The economic, political, and cultural transformations they spurred were integral to shaping the Europe that would later dominate the globe in the age of exploration and colonialism. The impact of the Crusades on power dynamics within the Catholic Church. The Crusades, a series of religious and military campaigns spanning several centuries, profoundly reshaped the power dynamics within the Catholic Church. These holy wars, initiated by the papacy and fought primarily between Christian and Muslim forces over control of the Holy Land, not only altered the political and social landscape of medieval Europe but also redefined the authority, influence, and internal structure of the Church itself. The repercussions of the Crusades extended far beyond the battlefield, affecting ecclesiastical hierarchy, papal supremacy, financial systems, and the relationship between the Church and secular rulers. Before the Crusades, the Catholic Church was already a dominant institution in medieval Europe, but its power was often contested by secular monarchs and local nobility. The Pope, while spiritually influential, frequently struggled to assert political control over kings and emperors. However, the call for the First Crusade by Pope Urban II in 1095 marked a turning point. By positioning the papacy as the moral and logistical leader of a sacred war, the Church gained unprecedented authority. The Pope was no longer just a spiritual figure but a unifying force capable of mobilizing armies, redirecting feudal violence outward, and consolidating Christian Europe under a single religious cause. The success of the First Crusade in capturing Jerusalem in 1099 further elevated the Church's prestige. The establishment of Crusader States in the Levant reinforced the idea that the papacy had divine favor, strengthening its claim to universal leadership over Christendom. However, as subsequent crusades faltered, ending in failure, betrayal, or outright disaster, the Church's image suffered. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204, a Christian city, exposed the moral and strategic weaknesses of papal authority. Critics within and outside the church began questioning the legitimacy of crusading as a holy endeavor, leading to internal divisions and challenges to papal infallibility. Financially, the Crusades transformed the church into a wealthier and more centralized institution. To fund these expensive campaigns, the papacy imposed taxes, such as the Saladin tithe, and encouraged donations in exchange for spiritual indulgences. This influx of wealth increased the church's economic power but also led to corruption and abuses, fueling movements like the Protestant Reformation centuries later. Additionally, military orders such as the Knights Templar and Hospitaller, initially created to protect pilgrims, amassed vast resources and influence, sometimes rivaling the authority of bishops and even the Pope. The Crusades also intensified the church's role in political affairs. Popes like Innocent III used crusading ideology to suppress heresy within Europe, launching campaigns like the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars. This expanded the church's judicial and coercive powers, turning crusades into tools for internal control. However, reliance on secular rulers for military support sometimes backfired, as kings like Philip IV of France manipulated crusading rhetoric to weaken papal authority, culminating in events like the suppression of the Templars and the Babylonian captivity of the papacy in Avignon. In the long term, the Crusades contributed to both the zenith and decline of medieval papal power. While they initially bolstered the church's influence, the eventual failures, financial exploitation, and political entanglements eroded its moral authority. By the late Middle Ages, the church faced growing dissent, setting the stage for the challenges of the Renaissance and Reformation. Thus, the Crusades were not merely external military campaigns but pivotal events that reshaped the Catholic Church's internal power structure, leaving a complex legacy of triumph and turmoil. The economic benefits of increased trade with the Near East during the Crusades. The Crusades, a series of religious and military campaigns initiated by Latin Christendom between the 11th and 13th centuries, were not merely a clash of faiths or a struggle for territorial dominance. Beyond the battles and the ideological fervor, these campaigns facilitated an unprecedented expansion of trade between Europe and the Near East, reshaping the economic landscape of the medieval world. The interaction between European merchants, Levantine traders, and the diverse cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean led to a flourishing exchange of goods, knowledge, and wealth. This transformation had profound and lasting effects on the economies of both regions, fostering commercial networks, stimulating urban growth, and introducing new commodities that would alter European consumption patterns forever. One of the most significant economic benefits of this increased trade was the revival of Mediterranean commerce. Before the Crusades, Europe's economic connections with the Near East had been limited, constrained by political fragmentation, weak maritime infrastructure, and the dominance of Byzantine and Islamic intermediaries. However, the establishment of Crusader states such as the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, and the Principality of Antioch created a direct Latin presence in the Levant, providing European merchants with secure access to key trading hubs. Cities like Acre, Tyre, and Antioch became bustling centers of commerce where goods from the East, spices, silks, dyes, and precious stones, were exchanged for European products such as wool, timber, and metals. The Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, played a pivotal role in this commercial expansion. Their fleets transported crusaders to the Holy Land, but more importantly, they secured lucrative trade agreements with both Crusader and Muslim rulers. In exchange for naval support, these republics obtained tax exemptions, property rights, and exclusive trading privileges in key ports. Venice, for instance, gained control over crucial quarters in Tyre and Acre, allowing its merchants to dominate the spice trade. Genoa established a powerful commercial network extending from the Black Sea to North Africa, while Pisa secured advantageous positions in lesser but still profitable markets. The wealth accumulated by these city-states fueled their rise as economic powerhouses, laying the foundations for the capitalist economies of the Renaissance. The influx of Eastern goods into Europe had a transformative effect on European markets. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, once rare and prohibitively expensive, became more accessible to the European elite. These commodities were not merely culinary luxuries but also essential for food preservation in an era before refrigeration. The demand for spices stimulated the growth of merchant guilds and trading companies, which financed expeditions and established distribution networks across Europe. Similarly, the introduction of fine silks, cotton, and damask textiles revolutionized European fashion and manufacturing. The techniques of silk production, learned from Byzantine and Muslim artisans, were later replicated in Italian cities like Lucca and Venice, reducing Europe's dependence on imports and fostering local industries. Another crucial economic benefit was the transfer of advanced agricultural and artisanal knowledge. The Crusaders encountered sophisticated irrigation systems, new crops, and refined craftsmanship in the Near East. Sugarcane, citrus fruits, and rice were introduced to Europe through these exchanges, diversifying agricultural production and improving diets. The sugar plantations established in Cyprus and Sicily by Crusader settlers became highly profitable enterprises, foreshadowing the later Atlantic sugar economy. Similarly, the glassmaking techniques of Syria and Egypt influenced Venetian glass production, turning Murano into a center of luxury glassware. These innovations not only enriched European material culture but also created new industries that generated employment and wealth. The monetary economy of Europe also experienced significant changes due to increased trade with the Near East. The flow of gold and silver coins from Muslim and Byzantine mints into European markets helped alleviate the chronic shortage of precious metals that had hindered economic growth in the early Middle Ages. The reintroduction of gold coinage in Europe, exemplified by the Florentine florin and the Venetian ducat, was partly inspired by the stable and widely accepted Islamic dinar. These reliable currencies facilitated long-distance trade, banking, and credit systems, enabling merchants to conduct business across vast distances with greater security and efficiency. The rise of medieval banking families, such as the Bardi and Peruzzi of Florence, can be traced back to the financial demands of crusading and Eastern trade. Urbanization was another lasting consequence of this commercial expansion. The wealth generated from Levantine trade fueled the growth of port cities and market towns across Europe. Marseille, Barcelona, and Montpellier flourished as gateways for Eastern goods entering Western Europe. In the interior, fairs such as those in Champagne became crucial nodes where Italian and Flemish merchants exchanged spices, wool, and luxury items. The economic vitality of these urban centers attracted artisans, bankers, and skilled laborers, creating a more dynamic and interconnected European economy. The rise of a merchant class challenged the feudal order, as wealth increasingly derived from commerce rather than land ownership alone. The Crusades also indirectly stimulated European exploration and maritime technology. The need to maintain supply lines to the Levant encouraged advancements in shipbuilding, navigation, and cartography. The adoption of the compass, astrolabe, and lateen sail, technologies refined by Arab and Byzantine sailors, enhanced European maritime capabilities. These innovations would later prove essential during the Age of Discovery, when European explorers sought new routes to the riches of the East following the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453. However, the economic benefits were not one-sided. The Near East also profited from this intensified exchange. Muslim merchants in Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad accessed European silver, timber, and weapons, which were scarce in their own regions. The Ayyubid and Mamluk dynasties levied taxes on trade passing through their territories, enriching their treasuries. The cultural and scientific exchanges that accompanied trade, such as the transmission of Greek philosophical texts via Arabic translations, had intellectual repercussions far beyond mere economics. In conclusion, the economic benefits of increased trade with the Near East during the Crusades were manifold and far-reaching. The commercial networks established during this period revitalized the European economy, introduced new goods and technologies, and laid the groundwork for the capitalist transformations of the late medieval and early modern periods. While the Crusades were ultimately a military and religious failure, their unintended economic consequences reshaped the trajectory of European history, linking it irrevocably to the wider world. The influence of the Crusades on the political structures of Denmark and Sweden. The Crusades, a series of religious and military campaigns initiated by Latin Christendom between the 11th and 13th centuries, had far-reaching consequences beyond the Holy Land. While the primary focus was on reclaiming Jerusalem and combating Islamic powers, the ripple effects of these campaigns extended deep into northern Europe, shaping the political landscapes of emerging kingdoms such as Denmark and Sweden. The Northern Crusades, though distinct from their Middle Eastern counterparts, played a pivotal role in consolidating royal authority, expanding territorial control, and integrating these Scandinavian realms into the broader European feudal and ecclesiastical systems. In Denmark, the Crusades provided a powerful ideological and political tool for the monarchy to strengthen its dominance. The Danish kings, seeking to assert their authority over a fragmented nobility and unruly regional chieftains, embraced the crusading ethos as a means of legitimizing their rule. The participation of Danish forces in campaigns against the pagan Wends and later in the Baltic region under the banner of Christian expansion allowed the crown to centralize military power and justify the imposition of royal taxes. The Church, as a key ally, reinforced the monarchy's divine right to rule, intertwining religious and political authority. The establishment of bishoprics and the confiscation of pagan lands further enriched the crown and the ecclesiastical hierarchy, reducing the influence of local warlords and fostering a more unified Danish state. Sweden, too, experienced profound political transformations due to its involvement in the Crusades, particularly in Finland. The Swedish monarchy, still in its formative stages, used the Crusades as a pretext to expand eastward, subduing Finnish tribes and incorporating their territories into the Swedish realm. This expansion was not merely territorial but also ideological, as the conversion of pagans to Christianity became a means of solidifying Swedish hegemony. The Church's growing influence, backed by papal endorsements, granted the Swedish kings a newfound legitimacy, enabling them to suppress rival factions and centralize governance. The Crusades also facilitated Sweden's integration into the broader European political order, as alliances with other Christian monarchies and the papacy enhanced its international standing. Moreover, the economic ramifications of the Crusades cannot be overlooked. The influx of wealth from plundered pagan lands, combined with increased trade ties with German and Baltic merchants, enriched the Scandinavian crowns, allowing them to fund larger standing armies and administrative apparatuses. This economic boon further diminished the power of regional nobles, who could no longer compete with the centralized resources of the monarchy. In essence, the Crusades acted as a catalyst for the political evolution of Denmark and Sweden, accelerating the transition from decentralized tribal societies to more cohesive feudal monarchies. By harnessing the ideological fervor of the Crusades, these kingdoms not only expanded their borders but also entrenched the authority of their rulers, laying the foundations for the modern Scandinavian states. Cultural exchanges between Europe and the Middle East during the Crusades. The Crusades constituted an era rich in historical transformations that were not limited to military and political conflicts but extended to profound cultural interactions between Christian Europe and the Islamic Middle East. This period, which spanned centuries, served as a bridge of communication between two worlds that were often geographically and intellectually separated. Through trade, scientific, and artistic exchanges, civilizations shared knowledge and innovations that influenced the course of history. In the scientific field, Europe witnessed a qualitative leap thanks to the knowledge transferred from Islamic centers of learning such as Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo. The works of Avicenna, Ibn Sina, Al-Razi, and Al-Hazen, Ibn al-Haytham, were translated into Latin, enriching the nascent European universities in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. The Crusaders also brought advanced medical techniques from the East, such as surgery and sterilization, which were relatively unknown in Europe at the time. The exchange was not limited to medicine but also included mathematics and astronomy, where Arabic numerals and the concept of zero were introduced, simplifying commercial and scientific calculations. In agriculture, the Crusades brought new crops to Europe, such as sugarcane, cotton, and citrus fruits, which altered dietary and economic patterns. Europeans also learned advanced irrigation techniques used in the Middle East, increasing the productivity of agricultural lands in Europe. In arts and architecture, Europe was influenced by Islamic decorative motifs, pointed arches, and vibrant dyes that the Crusaders observed in palaces and mosques. This influence later appeared in Gothic architecture, which borrowed some elements from Islamic design. Techniques for making luxurious carpets and textiles were also transferred, becoming symbols of opulence in European courts. Linguistically, many Arabic words entered European languages, particularly in fields like chemistry, e.g., alcohol, alkali, and navigation, e.g., ship, monsoon. Translation between Arabic and Latin flourished, expanding the horizons of knowledge in philosophy and the sciences. However, the exchange was not one-sided. The Islamic world was also influenced by European culture in some aspects, such as military construction techniques and weapon development. The Crusaders introduced certain social customs that took root in mixed cities like Acre and Tripoli, yet these exchanges were not without tensions, as cultural encounters sometimes became sources of conflict. While some European thinkers saw Islamic civilization as a model of progress, others viewed it with suspicion. Conversely, many Muslim scholars regarded Europe as culturally backward, despite acknowledging some aspects of its military strength. In conclusion, the Crusades were not merely bloody confrontations but also a channel for civilizational interaction that transformed both worlds. Through this period, knowledge and innovations were transferred, laying the foundations for the European Renaissance, while the Middle East maintained its role as a cradle of science and the arts. The Crusades and the militarization of the medieval church. The Crusades, a series of religiously sanctioned military campaigns waged between the late 11th and late 13th centuries, played a pivotal role in transforming the medieval church into a militarized institution. What began as a call to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control evolved into a broader movement that intertwined spiritual authority with martial power. The Church, once primarily a spiritual and administrative body, gradually embraced the sword as a tool of divine will, reshaping its identity and influence across Christendom. Before the Crusades, the Christian Church maintained a complex relationship with warfare. Early Christian teachings emphasized peace, and many church fathers, such as Augustine of Hippo, cautiously justified war only under strict conditions, later formalized as the concept of just war. However, the church itself did not directly engage in military endeavors. The rise of feudalism and the increasing power of warrior elites meant that secular rulers often dictated matters of war, while the church focused on spiritual guidance, diplomacy, and the consolidation of its moral authority. The turning point came with Pope Urban II's call for the First Crusade at the Council of Clermont in 1095. His speech, which promised spiritual rewards for those who took up arms, marked a dramatic shift. The church was no longer merely endorsing war, it was now orchestrating it. The success of the First Crusade, culminating in the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, reinforced the idea that holy war was not only permissible but divinely sanctioned. The Church's ability to mobilize vast armies across Europe demonstrated its newfound military influence. Subsequent crusades further entrenched this militarization. The establishment of military orders, such as the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers, symbolized the fusion of monastic piety and martial discipline. These orders, directly answerable to the Pope, operated as both religious institutions and elite fighting forces. They amassed wealth, land, and political power, becoming key players in the Crusader States and beyond. The Church's reliance on these orders blurred the line between clergy and soldiers, creating a new class of warrior monks who saw combat as an extension of their faith. Moreover, the Crusades expanded the scope of the Church's military ambitions. What began as campaigns to secure Jerusalem soon extended to conflicts against heretics, pagans, and political rivals within Europe itself. The Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars in southern France and the Northern Crusades targeting Baltic pagans illustrated how the Church wielded holy war as a tool for doctrinal enforcement and territorial expansion. Popes such as Innocent III further centralized this authority, declaring crusades not only in the East but against Christian dissenters, effectively turning the Church into a hegemonic military power. The financial and logistical demands of the Crusades also reshaped the Church's administrative machinery. To fund these expeditions, the Church imposed taxes, such as the Saladin tithe, and encouraged the sale of indulgences, linking financial contributions to spiritual benefits. This system not only financed wars but also deepened the Church's involvement in secular governance, as it coordinated with kings, nobles, and bankers to sustain its campaigns. Critics within the Church, such as Saint Francis of Assisi, opposed this militarization, advocating for peace and poverty instead. Yet, by the late Middle Ages, the Church had become irrevocably linked with warfare. The Crusades had transformed it from a purely spiritual institution into one that commanded armies, levied taxes for war, and dictated military policy. This legacy endured long after the Crusades ended, influencing later conflicts such as the Reconquista and the Wars of the Reformation. In essence, the Crusades were the catalyst that militarized the medieval church. By legitimizing holy war, creating religious military orders, and expanding the scope of its martial authority, the church assumed a role that would shape its political and spiritual trajectory for centuries to come. In the Middle Ages, religious military orders played a pivotal role in shaping the military strategies of the Catholic Church. These orders emerged in the context of the Crusades, where there was a need for organized and dedicated forces to protect Christian holy sites and support military campaigns in the Holy Land. These orders, such as the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Teutonic Knights, represented a unique fusion of monasticism and militarism, granting them significant influence within the church and on the battlefield. The influence of these orders on the church's military strategies was multifaceted. First, they introduced new concepts in military planning, such as the establishment of fortified castles and the development of advanced logistical networks to transport soldiers and supplies over long distances. Second, they contributed to the standardization of combat tactics, as the church relied on the expertise of these orders in organizing and training armies. Third, these orders played a diplomatic role, representing the church in negotiations with local rulers and other European powers. Moreover, the immense wealth accumulated by these orders, particularly the Templars, helped finance the church's military campaigns, enabling long-term strategic planning. However, this growing power also created tensions within the church, as some popes feared that the influence of the military orders might exceed their control, ultimately leading to the dissolution of some, such as the Templars, in the early 14th century. Nevertheless, the legacy of these orders continued to influence the church's military strategies even after their decline. The church adopted many of their organizational and tactical methods in later conflicts, such as the wars against the Ottomans in Eastern Europe. The long-term effects of the Crusades on the church's political power. The Crusades, a series of religious and military campaigns initiated by the Latin Church in the medieval period, had profound and lasting effects on the political power of the church. These expeditions, which spanned several centuries, were originally intended to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control, but their consequences extended far beyond their initial objectives. Over time, the Crusades reshaped the relationship between the church and secular authorities, influenced the church's role in European politics, and altered the perception of papal authority. The long-term political ramifications of these campaigns were complex, contributing both to the strengthening and eventual decline of the church's temporal influence. One of the most significant long-term effects of the Crusades was the enhancement of the papacy's political standing in Europe. The Pope, as the spiritual leader of Christendom, positioned himself as the supreme authority capable of mobilizing armies, negotiating with monarchs, and even deposing rulers who opposed the church's interests. The call for the First Crusade by Pope Urban II in 1095 demonstrated the church's ability to unite disparate European kingdoms under a common cause, thereby consolidating its influence. The success of the early Crusades further legitimized the papacy's role as a political arbiter, as kings and nobles sought papal approval for their military endeavors. This elevated the Pope's status not just as a religious figure but as a key player in medieval geopolitics. However, the Crusades also exposed the vulnerabilities of the church's political power. As the campaigns progressed, the initial religious fervor waned, and the motives of crusaders became increasingly entangled with personal ambition, economic gain, and territorial expansion. The failure of later crusades, such as the disastrous Fourth Crusade, which culminated in the sack of Constantinople in 1204, tarnished the church's moral authority. Critics within and outside the church began to question the papacy's justification for warfare in the name of faith, leading to internal divisions and weakening the unity of Christendom. The growing disillusionment with the Crusades eroded trust in papal leadership, creating fissures that would later contribute to challenges such as the Protestant Reformation. Another enduring consequence was the financial and administrative strain the Crusades placed on the church. To fund these expensive military campaigns, the papacy imposed taxes, such as the Saladin tithe, and expanded the use of indulgences as a means of raising revenue. While these measures initially bolstered the church's economic power, they also fostered resentment among European monarchs and commoners alike. The heavy financial burdens, coupled with accusations of corruption, sowed seeds of discontent that would later manifest in movements demanding church reform. The centralization of power in the papacy also led to conflicts with secular rulers who sought to assert their own authority, resulting in power struggles that diminished the church's political dominance over time. Moreover, the Crusades indirectly contributed to the rise of stronger centralized monarchies in Europe. As kings and nobles participated in the Crusades, they gained military experience, expanded their networks, and sometimes acquired new territories, which strengthened their own political positions. Upon their return, many rulers leveraged their enhanced prestige to challenge ecclesiastical authority. The conflict between Pope Boniface VIII and King Philip IV of France in the early 14th century, which resulted in the Papal Schism and the eventual relocation of the papacy to Avignon, exemplified this shift in power dynamics. The Church, once the dominant political force in medieval Europe, found itself increasingly subordinate to emerging nation-states. In the broader historical context, the Crusades also had unintended consequences that reshaped the Church's relationship with other religions and cultures. The encounters with the Islamic world, Byzantine Empire, and other civilizations exposed Europe to new ideas, trade routes, and knowledge, which gradually diminished the Church's monopoly over intellectual and cultural life. The rise of secular thought, spurred in part by these exchanges, further undermined the Church's political influence in the long run. Ultimately, while the Crusades initially amplified the Church's political power by reinforcing papal authority and unifying Christian Europe under a common cause, their long-term effects were more ambiguous. The financial burdens, moral controversies, and shifting political landscapes they engendered contributed to the gradual decline of the Church's temporal dominance. By the late medieval period, the papacy's political authority was no longer as unchallenged as it had been during the height of the Crusades, setting the stage for the transformative changes of the Renaissance and Reformation eras.